evening. My name's Paul Webley. I'm the Director and Principal of SOAS. I'd like to welcome you all in the audience tonight, particularly those who've travelled a long way to be here. And I know we have some people who've come from Scotland and Durham, but possibly some from even further afield. It's great to see Nirmala's family here, especially her mother, husband and sons. I'm sure they'll enjoy seeing her in this rather different setting. Inaugurals really are something special. Nirmala told me this is the first time that her mother has come to a university event, so I think that's going to be a particularly special occasion for her. We have many guests here tonight, as you can see. I won't list them all, but I would like to mention the former colleagues of Nirmala's from Goldsmiths, including the Warden, Professor Geoffrey Crossick and his team, colleagues from King's College, where Nirmala is the external examiner, Chief Executive, colleagues from the Architects Registration Board, on which Nirmala served for 6 years, council members of the Royal Society for Asian Affairs, and colleagues from the top management programme, including the Vice-Chancellor of Essex University, Professor Colin Riordan. And for the first time since I've been at SOAS, my wife. You'll notice she didn't come to my inaugural, but she has come to Nirmala's. The fact that we're all here, the fact that all these guests are here is a tribute to Nirmala. I'm sure all our guests, including all of us here, know that they're in for an enlightening evening. We're pleased to see you all. I know that people have come a long way to be here. We really appreciate you taking that trouble. It all adds up to the very special occasion that is a SOAS inaugural. It's a ceremony. It's a rite de passage for the speaker. Even in someone as experienced as Nirmala, I've noticed a slight frisson of nerves. Mostly nerves about whether her husband was going to turn up on time, actually. A ceremony, a rite de passage, and of course, a celebration of intellectual achievement. I'm particularly pleased to preside over this inaugural lecture, and not just because Nirmala is the Vice Principal here, and someone with whom I work very closely and have a great deal of affection and respect for, but also because I've read some of Nirmala's work. I particularly enjoyed a book on cities in transition, growth, change and governance in 6 metropolitan areas. I read the chapter on Hyderabad with great interest before I visited that city. I strongly recommend it for all of you. So I know that this evening we can expect fine analysis, clarity, insight and impact in her inaugural lecture entitled Projections of Empire, India and the Imagined Metropolis. We're also very honoured this evening as the session will be chaired by Professor Sir Graham Davis, the Vice-Chancellor of the University of London. Now, Professor Davis was born and brought up in New Zealand, was educated at the University of Auckland and the University of Cambridge, and after academic posts in Auckland and Cambridge, he became Professor of Metallurgy, I hope I've got that right, at Sheffield University. He's been Vice-Chancellor of the University of Liverpool, he's been Vice-Chancellor of the University of Glasgow, he's now Vice-Chancellor of the University of London, and in between those Vice-Chancellorships, he also fitted in being Chief Executive of the Funding Council for England, which meant that he was in control of all the universities in the UK. So he's someone of no importance whatsoever. Actually, we are very honoured and we're very pleased that you've agreed to be here. At the end, the vote of thanks will be given by Peter Robb, Professor of the History of India here at SOAS. Professor Robb really needs no introduction to most of us here. He too is a New Zealander, was educated at the Victoria University of Wellington. I should say when I first came to the University of London, I thought the whole place was run by a mafia of New Zealanders. He's held appointments at SOAS since 1971, most significantly as the head of Department of History, but he's also the Pro-Director from 2003 to 2008 and worked with me very closely when I first arrived. He's the author of a number of excellent books and articles, notably his History of India and 2 volumes of his collected essays, Empire, Identity in India. We're very grateful to both of them to being part of today's event. Now, to introduce Professor Rao, I'm going to pass over to the Vice-Chancellor. So, great.
Let me repeat Paul's welcome. He made reference to the fact that inaugural lectures are rites of passage. Indeed they are, and they're very important. I've always enjoyed them because one of the things that is great about being in the academic world is having the opportunity to hear genuine experts amongst one's colleagues from fields other than one's own speak about the things that they know such a lot about and which they are passionately committed to. And I have no doubt that is what we are going to enjoy this evening. I've had the pleasure of working quite closely with Nirmala, both when she was at Goldsmiths and since she has moved to SOAS, and I found her a most congenial and committed colleague, as I'm sure those who worked with her in her previous appointments before she came to SOAS, and those in SOAS also find. For those who don't know, let me give you a little bit of the background to Nirmala's life, which led to her being here in this very important role this evening. She came into the United Kingdom in 1988, having completed an MA and an MPhil at Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. She was appointed to a research post shortly after arrival at the Runnymede Trust, and from there moved on to the Policy Studies Institute, where she was responsible for a series of studies of the transformations that were then taking place in British local government. I'm sure trying to come to grips with British local government must have been a very interesting initiation into the ways of the United Kingdom. Subsequently, she was funded by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation to take up a post at Queen Mary and Westfield College, where she completed her doctorate and in 1994 published it as The Making and Unmaking of Local Self-Government. About that time, I had just left my post at Liverpool, and I had had the experience of watching the making and the unmaking of local self-government. She was then appointed to a lectureship at Goldsmiths College, where she progressed very steadily but quickly up the academic ladder, becoming head of department 5 years later and gaining a personal chair in 2002. And all of us who are part of the academic world know that that is not an easy thing to achieve. Our colleagues are exceptionally critical when it comes to making promotions to personal professorships. She completed her headship of department and then won a fellowship which allowed her to work on local self-government in India. In 2005, she was appointed as Pro-Warden academic to Professor Crossick, who, as you heard, is with us this evening. During those years, she continued her research, which is something I always admire, because so often as academic management becomes predominant, people let their fingers slip off research. And those who don't, like Nirmala, I think have to be recognized as often being an exceptional band. She published a number of books. Among these, the most recent published were Governing London, with the late Ben Pimlott, the warden prior to Geoffrey Crossick, and the book that Paul referred to, Cities in Transition, a study of urban change in 6 metropolitan cities. Like the best of academics, she has not just restricted her activities to the academic life. She has contributed a great deal into the public domain as a lay member of the Bar Council, as a non-executive director of Ealing Hospital's National Health Service Trust, as a member of the Architects Registration Board, and as a trustee of the Learning from Experience Trust. In 2008, she relocated to Bloomsbury to join the team in SOAS as Vice Principal for Learning and Teaching. The lecture she's going to give to you, she tells me, draws upon some of my past work by bringing together my interest in local self-government and my deep attachment to India and to the School of Oriental and African Studies. Nirmala, it is my pleasure to invite you to present your inaugural lecture, Projections of Empire, India and the Imagined Metropolis.
Thank you, Vice Chancellor, for your very kind words. I hope I can live up to your generous introduction. I'd like to thank you all for coming this evening and thank those of our staff who put so much effort into preparing for this evening's event and setting up this lecture theatre. In particular, I'd like to thank Fiona McWilliams and her team, Rebecca and Katie. And I'd like to also thank Jahan Latif, Jens Franz, Patrick Campbell, and Jonah Foren for providing technical and other support. And of course, Tracy in the directorate. Thank you all very much. I just have to say we are not usually so lavish in our decorations, but happily this lecture coincides with the Hindu festival of Diwali. So may I take this opportunity to wish you all a happy Diwali. Of course, for me, this is a poignant moment as I stand before you to deliver a lecture to mark my arrival here at this School of Oriental and African Studies. Poignant because nowhere could it be more fitting to address issues that go to the heart of the interconnections between London and India than here at this great school. It was, in fact, exactly a century ago, in September 1909, that Lord Morley, Secretary of State for India, announced the government's agreement that given London's close relations with the Near East, the Middle East, the Far East, and Africa, the metropolis of the British Empire should become the seat of a great Oriental school. All the events and decisions that culminate in our being here today stemmed from a report of a committee under Lord Ray, former Governor of Bombay and President of the British Academy. Lord Ray had argued that a school of living Oriental languages would be incomplete without teaching the life, the history, the religion, the manners and customs, and law of the people speaking those languages. His concerns were reflected in the charter of the school, which sought to serve those about to proceed to the East or to Africa for study and research, for public service or commerce, or the pursuit of a profession. And when this very school was opened by King George V on 23rd February 1917, Lord Curzon, in his reply to the King's address, expressed the hope that, with the passage of time, this place would become a sort of clearinghouse of ideas between the East and West. This was, of course, a time when imperial competition was intensifying. The expansion of the European empires into Southeast Asia and Africa, and the political and administrative reforms in British India seemed to call for the formation in London of an imperial training center, and so it became. The new school had, however, first to dispel the notion, widespread at the time, that its underlying purpose was not learning for its own sake, but to train colonial officials and spies. It need then hardly to be said that there's a deep personal satisfaction here for me to address you as an Indian academic and as an officer of the school. And a special satisfaction to see so many of my colleagues, my new friends and old, members of my community, my family, and my dear friends from Ealing. I cannot acknowledge you all individually, of course, but I would like to make a point of welcoming and thanking my mother for being here tonight. అమ్మ నువ్వు ఇవాళ వచ్చినందుకు నాకు చాలా సంతోషం. నన్ను జీవితంలో ప్రోత్సహించినందుకు, ఇవాళ నేనేం మాట్లాడుతున్నానో అర్థం కాకుండా మా అందరితో ఉన్నందుకు నా కృతజ్ఞతలు. That greeting to my mother was in our language, Telugu, a South Indian language that was among the first to be taught to students of SOAS in 1917, as it happened by a Scotsman, Dr. Fraser. Sadly, as with so many other languages, it's no longer in our curriculum today. For those like myself who grew up and studied in India, the name of SOAS was a kind of beacon, signaling the most serious and important place of scholarship. I did not know at the time that I would continue my career here, nor that I would be speaking to you about the profound relationship between India and the metropolis. Some of what I'll say this evening explores that connection. But let me first explain my title, Projections of Empire, and use it to signpost where I hope to take you in this next hour. We have become accustomed today to the vocabulary of power projection and the convenient distinction between hard power, coercion through military force or the threat of it, and soft power, coercion through the exercise of influence. Equally, we are familiar with the projection of image in the advertising industry. In psychoanalysis, projection refers to investing significant others with our own suppressed and unconscious feelings and impulses. My use of the term in this lecture has something of all of these meanings, as I deal with the ways in which the imperial idea found expression through myths and images, through investing familiar artifacts with special meaning, and through the intentional myth-making of public buildings, icons, and celebrations. I began planning this lecture with the idea that I might confine myself to the projection of the metropolitan power's imagined right to rule over India. But I soon found that there was much to be said about the different ways in which the British presence in India was expressed during the imperial heyday, and in turn about how the British authorities represented the imperial project to their own citizens, especially in this capital city of the empire, our imagined metropolis. There is, as you'll recognize, a useful ambiguity in that term, metropolis. We use it to refer both to the governing center of an imperial system and to a great city that itself exercises influence over a vast hinterland. London, of course, was both. And I want to conclude with some thoughts on what it has meant to imagine this great city making the transition from an imperial capital to a global city. Losing an empire, we might say, and seeking to find a role. Projection, then, in the sense in which I shall be using it, is essentially an imaginative act, a way of making sense of the unfamiliar in terms that serve an underlying interest. So I shall begin at the beginning with the challenge that governing India posed to the comprehension of administrators and the wider public during the high tide of empire. Initially, India was a focus of curiosity. The first map of Hindustan was published in 1788 and was followed by a surge of interest in travelers' tales and dubious cultural histories. When William Hodges was commissioned by Governor-General Warren Hastings to make a series of drawings of Indian scenes, he expressed surprise that so little should be known in Britain about the face of the country and its art. On the other hand, the public were aware of and perhaps entertained by what was termed the laws and the religion of the Hindu tribes. It was this fascination with the exotic East that fed public curiosity and the scholarly desire to come to terms with India. On a higher plane, Hastings introduced the first translation from the Sanskrit of the Bhagavad Gita. He predicted that those Hindu scriptures will survive when the British dominion in India shall have long ceased to exist and when its sources of wealth and power are lost to remembrance. Coming to terms with India, however, did not extend to an acceptance of the indigenous cultures, beliefs, and traditions. Instead, the British drew upon their entrenched views of what constituted a civilized people. Viewing India through that prism, colonial rulers sought to transform the mysterious and exotic subcontinent according to an European image, and so claim a right to rule. This fancy depended on the accumulation of a body of scholarly knowledge, which served a metropolitan historiography and sustained a myth of common origins. That Indian and Europeans were essentially similar creatures, but at different stages of development from their common point of origin. Attributing Western and Oriental civilizations to a single point was the simplest way of getting a handle on the strangeness of India and making it familiar. The frame of reference immediately to hand was that of classical antiquity. Sir William Jones drew parallels between Hindu and classical gods, and his investigation of the linguistic affinities between Sanskrit and the Indo-European languages provided an acceptable account of common origins. He argued that no philosopher could contemplate the resemblances between Sanskrit, Greek, and Latin without imagining all three to have sprung from a common source from which they had since diverged. Jones was seeking to enhance Europe's understanding of Indian culture, and his lectures and writings found a ready and sympathetic audience in Britain. And of course, to some extent, this enterprise was reciprocated as Indians like Raja Ram Mohan Roy encouraged an Indian understanding of Western science and philosophy. These claims to fundamental equivalence could, however, only be made plausible and acceptable to a wider public by proposing that Indian civilization nonetheless lagged far behind that of Europe. According to the historian Henry Maine, India shared with Europe a whole world of Aryan institutions, customs, laws, and beliefs. Yet the development of those institutions had been arrested at an early stage. It was a culture in stagnation. Still locked in barbarism, there were aspects of Indian civilization that had yet to unfold. Some administrators assumed that Indians would gradually acquire Western political and moral qualities, yet despaired of what they saw as the degradation of everyday Indian practices. These myths of common origin and differential development had a convenient implication, that the British could be at one and the same time custodians of India's ancient traditions and agents of modernity. The dualism of ancient and modern could not be long sustained. In practice, revulsion at what was seen as Indian backwardness presented challenges to the modernizers. They struggled to govern a country that was steeped in the exotic, aspects of which were mesmerizing and compelling, with stunning princely artifacts coexisting with the horrific traditions of sati. These tensions provided a platform for a program of change and governance reform which engaged the passions of modernizing liberals who were, to a man, impatient of the romantic Orientalism of Jones and his followers. So while scholars struggled to find common origins of Indian and European society, others were less impressed by the claims to moral and cultural equivalence. James Mill dismissed the dubious and unprovable claims of the antiquarians and anthropologists. In his History of British India, he castigated Hinduism as the main reason why Indians had made so little progress towards civilization in the contemporary European sense. In his view, the East India Company had been too lenient in preserving worthless Indian institutions and introducing defective European ones. Instead, he favored a managerial, even despotic approach to governance. So too did James Mill's son, John Stuart, whose hierarchical classification of societies located India firmly amongst the lower levels. In his masterpiece, Representative Government, he argued that communities ranged from high civilization downwards to conditions very little above the highest of the beasts. Such savage societies required absolute rule and unquestioning obedience. 2 notches above lay Egypt, China, and India, Oriental societies whose development have been arrested and where a paternal despotism was required to impose progress from above. The Mutiny of 1857, known to us as the First War of Independence, put paid to attempts by the previous generation of British administrators and liberal reformers to mold Indian society along English lines. When the Government of India Act laid the East India Company to rest, it instituted what amounted to a novel political order. The British government established a new structure of political authority in India, the ritual center of which was Queen Victoria as a sovereign of Great Britain and from 1877, Empress of India. In this sense, the Act was intended to strike a balance between reasserting imperial control and conciliating the Indian population. The new regime was interpreted as a gesture from the imperial authority that the rights of native citizens would be upheld before the law and their customs and traditions respected. Yet it was not intended to open the door to representative government. Representative institutions were seen as alien to Indians. Asiatic government favored absolute rule. Hence, Britain's sovereignty over India had to take the form of a constitutional bureaucracy governing in accordance with rules. This benevolent administrative despotism was not to prove a permanent solution. It would, in the course of time, be challenged by developments at home, as a close connection emerged between the campaigns for elective local government in both England and India. The creation of a pyramid of elected councils in England and Wales during the later 19th century was predicated upon the idea of political education as a route to the achievement of responsible self-government. This was as desirable for India as for the metropolitan power. Soon, the idea took shape that what was good for England herself should also be good for the territories for which she has assumed responsibilities. And it was chiefly in India that these ideas received some practical embodiment. The watershed was marked with Lord Ripon's initiative in 1882, which proposed the establishment of municipal and district boards throughout India. As Viceroy, Lord Ripon declared that the primary function of local government was political education, something of greater importance than administrative efficiency. This commitment to Indian political development through local government was advanced, albeit slowly, in a series of further steps. The Royal Commission on Decentralization of 1908, the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms of 1918, and the Statutory Commission of 1930. In August 1917, Britain promised responsible government to India through the gradual development of self-governing institutions. India's Secretary, Sir Edwin Montagu, proclaimed that his objective was to bring about the increasing association of Indians in every branch of the administration. He would accomplish this by the gradual development of self-governing institutions with a view to the progressive realization of responsible government of India as an integral part of the empire. Together with the Viceroy, Lord Chelmsford, he considered that India could be reshaped in the image of England, that responsible government, as the best form of government that the English know, should be extended there. These enthusiasms were not universally shared. When leaving the office of Secretary of State for India, Austen Chamberlain had taken it upon himself to warn Lord Chelmsford that Indian self-government was a distant goal, and anyone who pretends it's realizable today or in the early future is no friend to the government and no friend to India itself. In a speech to the Central Legislative Council, Chelmsford nevertheless reiterated that the domain of urban and rural self-government is the great training ground from which political progress and a sense of responsibility have taken their start. Montagu agreed. The development of Indian government, he insisted, should be one of gradual and increasing decentralization. As we give more functions to local government, he argued, we must give more and more responsibility to India and keep less here. Politically, this was a divisive issue. For the British governing class, Indian self-rule was an unthinkable prospect. The decentralization reforms, supported by some imperial administrators, tolerated almost in absence of mind by others, faced implacable opposition from most. In any event, projecting benign imperial notions of political development through local government reform proved a blind alley. Freedom from British rule was to be achieved not by gradualist administrative reform, but by the nationalist movement. Hardly 30 years had gone by since Chamberlain's dismissal of its possibility when Mountbatten, the last viceroy, stood together with Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru to witness India's tryst with destiny. The engagement of Indians in the limited political structures that the British conferred upon them was intended to communicate Indian interests to the metropolitan power. The corollary was Britain's need to project images of imperial power both to its Indian subjects and in turn to its own citizens. This was in part a matter of symbolic representation, expressed through public buildings, art, events, and rituals. Take, for example, the work of British painters in India. They represented the imperial order in ways that enabled people at home to envisage India in their own terms, thereby encouraging a belief that they understood that world, felt at home in it, and could dominate it. Of course, it would take more space than I have this evening to deal with all these forms of projection. So instead, I'll take a closer look at the attempts by British architects working in India to express domination and subjection through public buildings. It was an ambiguous undertaking, reflecting both conceptions of difference and a framework within which they could be reconciled. Reconciled, that is, through a fusion of imperial and indigenous styles that only the imperial authority could bring about. The point is this. If it were possible for European architects to achieve a fusion between contrasting Oriental styles, then it would confirm the ability of a Western power to transcend native divisions and produce a new and superior synthesis. By drawing together forms distinctly labeled Hindu and Saracenic, the British proclaimed themselves the masters of India's physical culture, able to shape a harmony the Indians could not themselves achieve. To British eyes, Hindu architecture was startling in its lack of symmetry. And in the 18th century, the conventions of landscape painting required Indian buildings to be shown in simplified form and with an unrealistic symmetry imposed upon them. Similarly, when in the late 19th century, British architects started to erect buildings in India, they often adopted Indian design elements in a highly eclectic fashion, merging them at will with European conventions. Aesthetically, and perhaps not surprisingly, the result was distinctive, if sometimes an unhappy one. Let's take a look at 3 examples. Mayo College, Ajmer, built in 1870, combined Rajput and Mughal forms. This is perhaps the happiest example of fusion. Let's turn to Madras University's Senate House, which incorporated Byzantine design. Again, most would think it an elegant solution. However, a bizarre outcome of this melange of styles can be seen in William Emerson's design for Muir College in Allahabad. Here, Emerson sought, as he put it, not to follow too closely Indian tradition, but to adopt an Egyptian style of Muslim architecture, which he would work up with the Indian Saracenic of Bijapur and the northwest, confining the whole in a Western Gothic design, as we can see. The significance of public and monumental architecture is that it sought to present an idealized vision of society, expressing at one and the same time local, national, and imperial identities. The most dramatic and symbolically important manifestation of the British presence in India was the inauguration of New Delhi. Intended as a crowning achievement in colonial architecture and colonial town planning, a capital worthy of the British Empire. Architectural historian David Johnson describes the aspiration. New Delhi's precise location, its structures, its design, its rigorously controlled road grid, its monuments commemorating important imperial persons and events were artfully combined to make the capital a new temple of empire. The quintessential statement of what British imperial rule had meant and continued to mean for Britain and for India. The entire spatial layout of New Delhi's town plan and the architectural styles employed by its 2 primary architects, Edwin Lutyens and Herbert Baker, used the colonial built environment to express the imperial social order, created at the turning point between the high tide of empire and the ebb tide of independence, the Viceroy's Palace, today the Rashtrapati Bhavan, the seat of the President of India, provided the final and firmest statement of British authority in built form. With its immense size, huge dome, and seemingly endless ranks of massive classical columns, the Viceroy's Palace was at the same time the most ambitious of all the attempts to establish an architecture of fusion between a Saracenic Orientalism and Western classicism. Lutyens had dismissed Mughal architecture as piffle, yet his incorporation of Indo-Islamic forms with European and Buddhist styles created a vast but wonderfully harmonious urban space, unique in scale and expression. Ironically, though, while Lutyens sought to stamp imperial authority on India, on this vast ceremonial site, he did so at the very moment that India began to slip from the British grasp. As Jan Morris puts it, New Delhi was an anomaly, too late for arrogance, too soon for regrets. Successful or not, the public architecture and urban planning of the Raj projected imperial power to the Indian population. The corollary was that the public architecture and spaces of the metropolitan power itself should represent the imperial project to the British people. Whereas the first had been a sometimes fanciful architecture of cultural fusion, the reconfiguration of the heart of London contrived to express imperial ambitions to Londoners and to the world through an architecture of pride, possession, and show. In London, as in India itself, imperial architecture reflected Ruskin's concept that buildings were sermons in stone, and a new movement gathered force to promote grandiose public buildings that were national in expression and communicated British hegemony. By 1900, the capital city of the world's greatest empire was dotted with the visual symbols of power, conquest, and possession. Let's take a look at some examples. The Imperial Institute of 1893, the Great Exhibition of 1851 and those trade exhibitions that followed, and a wave of government office buildings, including the New India Office. These illustrate just how the vastness and power of the British Empire was projected to the home population. The Imperial Institute was built in South Kensington, dedicated to Queen Victoria, and opened on 10th May 1893 by the Queen Empress. Its opening ceremony was the last great state event to focus on the empire, with Britain as the leading nation on earth and the British monarch as the undisputed queen of the colonies and Empress of India. An orchestra of 100 musicians performed the Imperial March, which Sir Arthur Sullivan had written for the occasion. When the Queen Empress arrived in a carriage drawn by 6 cream-colored horses, she was greeted by 34 members of the royal family, a vast throng of ambassadors, foreign ministers, members of the cabinet, high court judges, and Indian princess. As a peal of bells rang out, a royal salute was fired in Hyde Park. The Archbishop of Canterbury pronounced a benediction, and the legendary Canadian diva, Emma led the singing of God Save the Queen. Of course, all that remains of the Imperial Institute today is the tower, as the rest of it was demolished in 1957 to provide for the expansion of Imperial College. Earlier celebrations of empire had been less about the crown and more about trade. When the Great Exhibition opened in Hyde Park in 1851, the East India Company seized the opportunity to display a comprehensive collection of Indian artifacts. This exhibition portrayed the rich and gigantic territory of India as having the potential to produce everything that civilized nations required. Celebrating India in this way, whilst eliding the issue of just what made a civilized nation, was a way of projecting a future for British commerce in the exploitation of Indian manufactures and natural resources. It's perhaps ironic that the products of an ancient civilization should be so admired by the very people who unthinkingly reserved the term civilized to themselves. By 1886, the fashion for exhibitions took a new direction to strengthen the bonds of empire through the stimulation of trade and commerce. In that year, more than 5 million visitors passed through the colonial and Indian exhibition. Admiring the regionally organized Indian courts, which portrayed the changing complexion and character of Indian art drawn from across the subcontinent. A dedicated Empire of India exhibition followed in 1895 at Earl's Court. If the Great Exhibition of 1851 had expressed a sense of opportunity that characterized the time, the later exhibitions set a tone of anxiety, reflecting the growing challenges to Britain's imperial dominance from the newly ascending economies of Germany and the United States. These nations had already succeeded in penetrating Britain's imperial markets, and there was a sense that the riches of the empire, which had historically reflected British economic superiority, might now be harnessed to preserve the nation's position in the face of fierce foreign competition. By the 1920s, the empire was increasingly seen as a market, and a fiercely contested market, for exported goods. Trade and empire came together in the huge industrial estate of Wembley, which was dominated by the twin towers of the Wembley Stadium, so recently lost to us. Originally constructed for the British Empire exhibition of 1924, the stadium overlooked the Empire Way, an impressive thoroughfare that leads today not to monuments of power, but to a complex of factories and warehouses. The highlight of the 1924 exhibition was the India Pavilion. Artifacts express and give effect to commercial relations. Something more was needed to express imperial might. And here the subliminal messages of British character and destiny were carried through the great wave of London's monumental public buildings of the second half of the 19th century. In the words of one critic, London's meaning was disclosed in the city's physical appearance, in the layout of streets and avenues, and in the buildings and public monuments which lined them. London's built environment should be appropriately imposing, should convey a sense of Britain's world role, of its preeminence, so that Londoners would, as if through a process of osmosis, come to understand what their attitudes towards empire and the imperialized peoples would be. So the imperial metropolis was not so much a machine for making money as it was, at least potentially, a machine for making imperialist-minded citizens. Here then was an architecture which was meant to display an imperial face to the world. For so huge a metropolis, the area of overt symbolism of governance was remarkably compressed. The triangle formed by Buckingham Palace, Trafalgar Square, and the Houses of Parliament, linked by the ceremonial avenues of the Mall and Whitehall, contained the greatest concentration of overt imperial motives. Jonathan Schneer captures it well as the capital of a formally constituted and governed empire upon which the sun never set. Power radiated from it along lines established by an imperial parliament. Formal tribute flowed into it from 100 client states. This imparted a certain atmosphere to the city's built environment, a certain ambience to its culture, a certain tone to its politics. This spatial mapping of empire could be seen in George Gilbert Scott's Foreign, Colonial, India, and Home Offices of 1868 to 73. Aston Webb's Admiralty Arch remodeled the southwest corner of Trafalgar Square, opening up a grand processional avenue to Buckingham Palace. Just south of the square, the Royal Colonial Institute in Northumberland Avenue, founded in 1868, provided a forum where gentlemen interested in colonial and Indian affairs could meet and enjoy opportunities for reading papers and for holding discussions and symposia upon colonial subjects generally. Of all London's imperial buildings, none was more so in concept than the New India Office, marking as it did a transition from the East India Company to direct rule as the emblem of the final establishment of British power in India. The new building marked the imperial status of both nation and its metropolis. And whereas East India House had been embellished with the figures and symbols of commerce and Christianity, the elaborate decorations of the new building showcased the heroes and heroic episodes of the British Empire in India. Governing rather than civilizing had become the dominant expressive theme. Journeying along the Strand from this imperial triangle, the visitor would have encountered a continuing celebration of empire, first with South Africa House, and then along to the Aldwych and the huge complex of Australia House. Then northwards through Kingsway to the more generically named Africa House. If the visitor retraced their steps to Aldwych, they would have arrived at India House, Here would be found what was described in a presidential address to Reba in November 1899 as an architecture that may enhance the glory of this great empire. Today, symbolic representations of this great empire no longer evoke a response from Londoners. Through the heyday of empire, a statue of Field Marshal Sir Hugh Rose, Commander-in-Chief of the British Army in India, and the man credited with putting down the 1857 insurrection in central India, stood at the junction of Knightsbridge and Brompton Road. He's there no longer, having been relegated to an obscure Hampshire village. Likewise, despite his prominent location in the southeast corner of Trafalgar Square, few will recognize the statue of Sir Henry Havelock, a once popular hero who, together with General Rose, suppressed with great ferocity the Indian Mutiny. In the year 2000, Mayor Ken Livingstone called for Havelock's removal from the square, but not on anti-imperialist grounds. This might seem curious given the depth of the atrocities committed by the troops under Havelock's command. But the mayor confessed that he had not a clue who the general was and what he did, calling simply for people on the plinths in the main square in a capital city to be identifiable to the generality of the population. Indifferent to complaints that he was consigning Britain's history to oblivion and trying to erase a fundamental part of our nation's heritage from the heart of our capital city, the mayor speculated that not one person in 10,000 going through Trafalgar Square knows any details about the lives of these generals. It's time, he said, to look at moving them and having figures on those plinths that ordinary Londoners would know. The mayor probably reflected popular opinion. But nor can we imagine that passions are greatly raised today by the more subtle imperial subtext to be read a mile or so to the east in the city of London itself. There lay the nexus of London's financial connections with India and the rest of the empire. St. Paul's Cathedral, the parish church of the empire, dominated the late 19th century skyline. Here, where military celebrations and state funerals are still held, the ritual celebrations of the Imperial Majesty were enacted most grandly during Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee of 1897. If the cathedral symbolized the authority of empire, the true imperial influence of London was captured in its financial and commercial interconnections, symbolized in Neil Lund's 1904 painting, The Heart of Empire. This celebrated painting captured the concentrated activity of the empire's financial center. Here, the dome of St. Paul's is in the background, while the monumental architecture of the Mansion House and the Bank of England draw the eye. According to Ian Black, in Rebuilding the Heart of Empire, this is a landscape of power. The monumental buildings signify the city's historic role as a world center of finance and trade. The view then stretches away to the horizon, suggesting the vastness of the imperial metropolis and contrasting the teeming activity of the center with the diffuse networks of commerce and exchange which made that power possible. So, Heart of Empire represents the characteristic image of the city's imperial centrality through the symbolic exchange between God and Mammon. This painting, purchased for the Lord Mayor and subsequently donated to the City Corporation, is rightly interpreted as an allusion to contemporary geopolitical theories of imperial destiny and as marking the ascendancy of London as a self-consciously financial, imperial, and regal capital. Set against these images of commercial dominance, the statues to the west were, of course, by 1900, misrepresentations of empire. It was the proud new banks and insurance buildings and colossal docks that stated the claims to be the powerhouses of imperial commerce. The activities that linked London and India were invisible to the eye, but the built structures through which they flowed were suggestive. Henry James was among the more suggestible. Gliding down the Thames on a steamer in midsummer 1877, he reflected that, like so many aspects of English civilization that are untouched by elegance or grace, the river has the merit of expressing something very serious. The polluted river, the sprawling barges, the dead-faced warehouses, the frowsy people. The atmospheric impurities become richly suggestive. It sounds rather absurd, but all this smudgy detail may remind you of nothing less than the wealth and power of British Empire at large. When I look off to the left at the East India Docks or pass under the dark, hugely piled bridges, where the railway trains and the human procession are forever moving, I feel a kind of imaginative thrill. The tremendous piers of the bridges, in especial, seem the very pillars of the empire. At the time James experienced that imaginative thrill, India occupied a major place in British overseas trade and was a linchpin of its position in the world economy, taking around 12% of British exports. We've seen that Victorian London was rich with the images of imperial power, some of the more significant of which were captured in Lynn's painting. The architecture of empire resonated powerfully with Londoners. From their recreations and entertainments, as well as from the great public buildings, Londoners learned, according to Jonathan Schneer, that British imperialists were heroes, the colonized peoples were inferior, and imperialism benefited all Britons. These sentiments undoubtedly outlasted empire as a system of governance and faded only with the passage of generations. In our own era, these monumental buildings and statues, so evocative in their own time, are now almost drained of meaning. Yet, just as the late imperial rebuilding of the city of London reflected the empire in its very fabric, so does the imperial landscape live on today, with the great bank buildings at the heart of the city generating echoes of empire in a post-imperial world. Of course, the City of London has retained a leading position in world finance and business services. Even after 1945, large sectors of the world still look to London for their trade. Supported by the system of Commonwealth preference, trade with the former colonies continued at record levels through the 1950s, amounting to about half of the movement of goods through the Port of London. The commercial monuments remained, most dramatically in the towering warehouses of London's Dockland, their names reverberating, as Gavin Waitman puts it, with imperial associations. And the docks were busier than ever before. In 1956, a record 70 million tons of goods were handled on London's docks and wharfs, with 1,000 ships docking weekly. Raw materials, tea especially from India, came in and manufactured goods went out. India came to be seen as a market for emerging British manufacturing interests, especially motor vehicles and industrial chemicals. But although British policymakers saw India as an important export market, and it remained so for chemicals, shipbuilding, textile machinery, and electrical goods well beyond independence, US competition and Indian industrialization gradually closed the door on British exports. Let's take a vivid example of the changing relationship between India and Britain, poignant perhaps because of the later associations with the place name. During the 1950s, the manufacturers AEC, based at Southall, built truck and bus chassis, which once bodied by the nearby Park Royal Works were exported throughout the Commonwealth. The AEC logo was a triangle, and across the bottom was the word Southall, which was the base of the plant. Wherever AEC vehicles were exported, so the name Southall was exported with it. And for the workforce, Southall was synonymous with AEC. There was great pride that the name Southall was on buses all over the world, as two retired AEC workers recalled for the ITV series, The Making of Modern London.
The capital's single most important export at this time was motor vehicles. The best-known homegrown companies were AEC, which built chassis here in Southall, and its partner Park Royal Bodybuilders. Together they formed one of the biggest bus and truck manufacturers in Britain. They had begun by building London buses, but by the 50s their exports to the Commonwealth were booming, as Alan Townsend remembers.
I worked here in the early 50s in the drawing office, where we dealt with contracts for fleets of buses from orders from all over the world, and in particular Commonwealth countries, New Zealand, Wellington Transport, Australia, Sydney, Adelaide, Melbourne, South Africa, Johannesburg, Pretoria. And these were often quite similar to the buses that were being built for service in this country, particularly in London, of course, the traditional double-decker. It was regarded in those days as the leading centre for bus design in the world in many ways.
On the shop floor at AEC, there was a tremendous skill and pride in bus building. To workers like Jack Aylesby, a coppersmith who later became shop foreman, London was still the workshop of the world.
It was a wonderful place to work in. Damn good team spirit. We had a fine body of craftsmen which produced these vehicles that went all over the world to the old Commonwealth and Empire. And there was great pride in everything everybody did.
Today, of course, it would seem that the Empire has returned to Southall, a place now synonymous with a large and thriving community of Punjabis from India, as you see here. London historian Jerry White has documented Southall's own arrival myth, wherein the personnel officer of Wool's Rubber Company, faced with a chronic labour shortage, set out to recruit from the Punjab the Sikh workers, whose commitment and reliability he knew from wartime army service. The company bought up houses close to their factory for the immigrant workers, and other local employers emulated their example. More Punjabis followed the initial rubber workers, and the first Sikh temple opened in 1959. By the late 1970s, Southall had the Indian cinemas, the banks, the grocers, the marriage bureaus, the clothing, and the jewelry stores that marked a mature Indian settlement. Southall was not immune to industrial change. In 1968, AEC's last Routemaster bus for export was completed at Southall. The 1970s saw the accelerating collapse of British manufacturing and of engineering exports to India, and indeed to the rest of the world. London was moving on, and the docks themselves were moving on and out downriver to Tilbury. The webs of commercial interdependency widened and deepened so that it became no longer appropriate to think of London as an imperial city, but rather as a world city of a different order, a global city. As of now, London competes with cities around the world. The financial services and banking industry competes with New York, Frankfurt, and Tokyo. Manufacturers compete with a range of locations, both in other regions of the UK and Europe, and low-cost manufacturing sectors in Southeast Asia. New knowledge and internet-based industries compete directly with Amsterdam, San Francisco, and Bangalore. Its fashion and creative industries stand head-to-head with New York, Paris, and Milan, while tourism competes globally. Today's projection of London as a global city owes much to our former Mayor Ken Livingstone's advocacy. However, its origins can be found in the regional planning guidance issued by the Conservative government in 1989, reinterpreted by the then London Planning Advisory Committee, and reworked again for the Government Office for London's strategic guidance in 1996. In these documents, the inner core of the capital regained some of the attention it had lost over many decades. Government now sought to sustain and enhance central London in its global city function and launched a landmark World City Study to assess London's competitive performance as measured against New York, Tokyo, Paris, Frankfurt, and Berlin. London's business community strongly supported this vision, emphasizing the attractiveness of the city, recently enhanced by the massive eastward extension of the central business district into the Isle of Dogs. Once elected as mayor, Livingstone eagerly built upon these foundations, strongly supporting the idea of the capital as a command post of the global economy, in which the central area expressed London's global position in finance and commerce. Today, the world itself and the entire global economy functions in the imagination much as empire had done a century before. Livingstone celebrated London as a challenge to the imagination. It's far from being a question of historic sites and ceremonials, he argued. the great city throughout the ages brings together in one place a critical mass of economic, scientific, cultural, and intellectual possibilities. And for the former mayor, the melting pot feature of the capital, diversity coupled with the most modern forms of communication is integral to London's character. In 1962, Dean Acheson famously accused Britain of having lost an empire, but not yet found a Rome. It was perhaps an oversimplification. True, Britain had relied upon its imperial status to underpin its position as a major world power. Now impoverished, post-war British governments calculated that granting independence to India and subsequently to other colonies would, through the creation of a Commonwealth of Nations, continue Britain's standing as a force to be reckoned with in the world. In presenting the Commonwealth as a shining example of international cooperation, as something to be cherished, something beyond criticism, British leaders had fallen victim to the politics of illusion. They failed to come to terms with Britain's relative decline, pinning their hopes upon the Commonwealth as a way of distancing the country from both American might and the gathering force of European integration. Even if it fell short of this grandiose aspiration, the Commonwealth served to cushion the impact of a vanishing power and prestige. It helped the British people to come gradually to terms with the loss of India without too much heartache. And as the empire became the Commonwealth, the royal tours replaced the progressions of colonial rulers. Cultural diplomacy supplemented political diplomacy, as you'll see in the recently opened Indian Royal Codes exhibition at the Victoria and Albert Museum. In the meantime, the experience of the Raj is still remembered here, and with some nostalgia. After half a century, the reunion dinners in London clubs testify to that nostalgia, albeit with a sad attrition of their attendance. I recall a retired Major General recollecting that when his soldier son received his own commission, he thought, oh, what's the use? After all, there's no India to go to. It's rather sad, reflected the father, for the younger generation that India no longer exists as it did. And remember, if you will, Paul Scott's post-independence novel, Staying On. Winner of the Booker Prize not so very long ago, its evocative portrayal captures the inability of some of the British to adapt, leave India, and return home. Nostalgia, of course, fades with the passage of the generations. But recently, we witnessed one of those periodic revivals of the imperial sentiment. Michael Palin, our respected honorary fellow of SOAS and newly elected president of the Royal Geographical Society, recently used his inaugural address to celebrate the imperial contribution to India and warn against denigrating the British presence. The rule of law, parliamentary democracy, the English language, and a passion for cricket are all among the beneficent legacies of the Raj. That much cannot be denied. But it's surely important that we don't lose sight of the darker side of imperial rule, with its attendant brutalities, sometimes committed by soldiers and commanders who, distant from metropolitan control, used unrestrained violence against Indians. Perhaps the most shocking aftermath of the 1919 massacre of Jallianwala Bagh at Amritsar is the enthusiasm with which an imperial-minded British population rallied in support of General Dyer. But what of the other legacy of empire? What mark has India left on London in the post-imperial age? From where we stand today, the transition from imperial capital to a global city, colored by images of thriving multicultural diversity, presents us with a face of London that would have been incomprehensible in the imperial heyday. Decades of migration from the Indian subcontinent has brought about a different metropolis, one in which the colonial inheritance of beliefs and practices have been displaced by the commercial, academic, and professional success of those diasporas. Yet these diaspora communities face their own post-imperial predicament, to stay on or to return, as successive generations adapt in ways that strain the bonds of culture and tradition. Like so many others, I too find myself trapped in the same dilemma. But for me at least, there's a sense of reconciliation afforded me by the opportunity to occupy the space between two worlds in serving this unique and wonderful School of Oriental and African Studies. Thank you.
Well, I was delighted when Nirmala asked me if I would say a few words at the end of this inaugural lecture. Not at all because she had taken on some of the role that I had once performed in SOAS, but in order that I might, as a South Asianist in the school, add to others a moment of welcoming her to our community. And it seems to me that what we've heard tonight is indeed a celebration of that movement to SOAS in so many different ways. The topic of this address is quite close to my own heart. As a postgraduate student, I spent some time reading the rather acrimonious correspondence which went on over the building of New Delhi, and I have spent a lot of time reading and thinking about the meanings and the projections of the British Empire, and I've recently been working on an architect who was responsible for some of the early building in Calcutta. So I'm probably not really a typical SOAS person, but if that trajectory means anything, then what we've heard tonight clearly shows that Nirmala has joined the SOAS community in this intellectual and scholarly way. I'm quite sure she's right in what she has said about the importance of the built environment and what it can tell us. I was very grateful for the complex way she had situated this. For my own work, it's clear that in the early stages of the buildings of empire in India, the primary audience was European. They were making compromises with India, they were making some changes because of India, but they were looking mainly to Europeans. Indians could copy if they wanted to. It's equally plain that in the period that Nirmala talked about most, that the audience for what was being done in India was primarily Indian, and that messages were being conveyed, sometimes quite deliberately, and that they were the messages which she'd explored. The other thing that an inaugural should do, I suppose, is make people think differently about things they thought they already knew. And what SOAS does today is partly about situating the vast proportion of the world that it deals with within Britain and making Britain look again at itself. Well, I think we have been looking again at London through Nirmala's eyes in a most fascinating way this evening. If you look at PEVs now on the buildings of London, there's a bit of mention of the empire and some references to grandiose spaces and spectacular skylines, as if that's the end of the story. Well, it's clear that the story is immeasurably more complicated and interesting than that. And I'm really grateful that Nirmala has begun to open our eyes and to make us look again at the city in which we live in a new way. And for that, and for all of the great merits and interests of her talk, I would ask you to join me in a moment in thanking her again. Before I finish, however, I'm supposed to remind you that there is a reception which is immediately above this building, to which everyone is invited to join. But thank you very much, Professor Rao.